Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to take a real close look at something super important for keeping us healthy. You ready?
Yeah, hit me with it.
All right, so it's vitamin B12 or cobalamin, if you want to get all technical. And, we all know it's good for us, right?
Right.
But I bet not a lot of folks have stopped to think about, where it actually comes from.
Yeah, I mean, you don't exactly see it growing on trees.
Exactly. And honestly, it's a pretty complex story.
Oh.
But that's why we're here today, to, uncover this whole fascinating process of how this vitamin is actually made.
Well, let's get into it then. I'm definitely curious.
So first off, get this. Vitamin B12 is only made by these teeny tiny microorganisms.
Wow. Okay, so right away we're talking about the microscopic world.
Right. And that means to make it on, an industrial scale, we've got to rely on this process called fermentation.
Fermentation. Okay, so we're talking about microbes doing the heavy lifting here.
You got it. So let's talk about these little factories. Our sources talk about a few main types of microorganisms that are involved.
Okay, lay it on me.
First up, we have Pseudomonas denitrificans. Sounds kind of scary, right?
A little bit.
But this guy seems to be like the star of the show when it comes to making B12 today, known for its high yields and all.
High yields, that's what we like to hear.
And get this, it can grow with or without a lot of oxygen. Scientists call it a facultative anaerobe.
Ooh, now that's versatile.
Right. And hold on, it gets even cooler. Scientists have figured out how to use genetically engineered strains to, really ramp up production.
That's amazing. So we're talking about really fine-tuning these microbes to produce as much B12 as possible.
Exactly. It's like super high-tech farming, but with these tiny little organisms.
Real wild.
So next up on our list of microbial workers is Bacillus megaterium.
Bacillus megaterium. Okay, what's its claim to fame?
Well, it's also used a lot in industrial production, and sometimes it's even teamed up with other microbes in this process called co-fermentation.
Co-fermentation, so like a team effort. Interesting.
And our sources describe it as gram-positive and spore-forming.
Ah, so now we're getting a bit more technical. That's a good sign.
So what does all that tell us?
Well, gram-positive just refers to the way scientists classify bacteria based on their cell wall structure. And for bacillus, this type of cell wall helps it form these tough little spores.
Spores. What are those?
Imagine like a little protective shell that the bacteria can hunker down in when conditions get rough. It's like a survival mechanism.
Ah, so it can handle some tough times. Makes sense for industrial settings, I guess.
Exactly. It means the bacteria can withstand things like heat or drying, which can be really helpful for maintaining a stable production process. You want those little factories chugging along smoothly.
I hear ya. Okay, so last but not least, we have Propionibacterium species like P. freudenweichi and P. shermani.
Those are some long names.
I know, right? But these guys have been around the block. They have historical importance in B12 production.
Oh, so like the OG B12 producers.
Exactly. And they produce B12 without oxygen. Pretty cool, huh?
That is cool, but why aren't they used as much these days?
Well, it turns out they have lower yields
Hmm.
and are a bit slower growing compared to Pseudomonas.
Ah, so they're not as efficient.
Sadly not. But they definitely played a big role back in the day.
Makes sense. So we've met our microbial workforce. Now, how do they actually get down to business and make the B12?
Yeah, let's get to the nitty-gritty. It's actually this complex, multi-stage process called submerged fermentation.
Submerged fermentation. Okay, I'm picturing microbes swimming around in some sort of broth.
That's pretty much it. And they often use this hybrid aerobic anaerobic approach, like switching between having oxygen and not having oxygen.
Like a carefully choreographed dance for these little guys.
Exactly. So first they go through this aerobic growth phase where it's all about getting a big old population of these microbes. They feed them carbon sources like glucose to keep their energy levels up, nitrogen, and a super important ingredient, cobalt.
Cobalt, that rings a bell. Isn't that part of the B12 molecule itself?
You got it. It's a key component. And sometimes they even add in some extra ingredients like, special precursors or something to give the whole process a little boost.
Interesting. So like giving them a little extra something to help them along.
Exactly. So they grow like crazy in this oxygen-rich environment. And then, boom, they switch things up and it's time for the anaerobic production phase.
The main event.
Yep. This is where they start pumping out that B12. And get this, they have to carefully control the feeding of carbon and cobalt during this phase. Oh, and there's this precursor feeding of something called DMB, which can actually limit how much B12 they make.
DMB. Sounds like a VIP guest at the B12 party.
Exactly. It's a crucial building block for the B12 molecule. But if they don't have enough of it at the right time, it can put a damper on the whole production.
Makes sense. Got to keep those microbes happy and well fed if you want them to do their job.
Absolutely. And it's not just about what they eat. There's a ton of process control involved, like making sure there's just the right amount of dissolved oxygen, keeping the temperature and acidity just right. They even have to control foam.
Foam, like in a beer.
Yeah, kind of like that. Apparently, too much foam can mess things up. It just shows you how precise this whole process has to be.
Wow, that's impressive. It's like a high-stakes microbial ballet.
Totally. So the microbes have done their job. They've made all this B12, but it's still trapped inside their cells. And that's where product recovery comes in.
The extraction.
You got it.
Yeah.
And this is where things get a little tricky. It's complex because the B12 is mostly intracellular, meaning it's inside the cells.
So we got to break those cells open to get to the good stuff. Sounds kind of messy.
It is. First, they have to separate the microbial cells from the liquid. They use this thing called centrifugation.
Centrifugation, like spinning them really fast to separate everything out.
Bingo. And then comes the fun part. They have to break open those cells to release the B12. Scientists call it lysis.
Lysis. Okay, I'm imagining tiny explosions happening on a microscopic level.
That's a pretty good visual. And there are a few ways to do it. They can use heat, chemicals, or even these special enzymes that basically eat away at the cell walls.
So we've popped open the cells. Now, how do we actually get the B12 out?
Right. So our sources mention solvent extraction, where they use things like chloroform to pull out the B12.
So the B12 is more attracted to the chloroform than the other stuff in the mix.
Exactly. Or they use this technique called adsorption chromatography with activated carbon.
Chromatography, that's a classic separation technique. I remember doing that in high school chemistry.
Yeah, it's like a way to purify and separate different components based on how they interact with certain materials.
So the activated carbon basically grabs onto the B12 and lets the other stuff pass through.
Exactly. And then they do even more purification using different types of chromatography. And after that, they try to get the B12 to form these, pretty little crystals. They call it crystallization. And then finally, they dry it all out.
So from microscopic factories to shiny crystals, it's quite the journey.
Right. And then, it's ready to be packaged up and sent out into the world.
To do all sorts of amazing things.
Exactly. Our sources point out that its main use is as a nutritional supplement in food fortification, which is especially important for people who don't eat meat.
Right. Vegans and vegetarians really need to make sure they're getting enough B12.
And of course, doctors use it to treat deficiencies. And you might be surprised to learn that it's also added to animal feed.
Really? Why is that?
Well, it turns out B12 can help animals grow bigger and healthier. Who knew, right?
That's fascinating. So we've got humans, animals, and even the scientific community benefiting from these tiny microbes.
It really is amazing, isn't it?
Absolutely. It
All
makes
right,
you
good.
realize how interconnected everything is.
Yeah, it's like this whole invisible world working behind the scenes to keep us all going.
Exactly. So to wrap things up, we've seen how vitamin B12 goes from being made exclusively by these microscopic organisms through this crazy cool fermentation process to a whole series of steps to extract and purify it. And ultimately, it plays a critical role in keeping us healthy.
Absolutely. And what's even more incredible is that something so essential starts with these little unseen factories.
Right. And when you think about it, modern health and nutrition really depends on these incredibly precise and controlled industrial processes, all thanks to advances in this field of biotechnology.
I think it really makes you appreciate the unseen world that sustains us.
Absolutely. It's pretty mind-blowing when you stop and think about it.
It really is. And that's a wrap for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure.